Welcome to this online instructional video. The focus of this economics learning session is the economics of markets. There's an old saying among economists: you teach a parrot to say supply and demand, and you have an economist. What is a market? A market is any institution which brings together buyers and sellers. We're trying to study markets in their purest form, as our introductory course attempts to emphasize the rationing function of prices and the invisible hand, the basic economics of demand and supply. This assumption of a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers is vital to our initial inquiry into markets. How so? We're trying to study what is known as the rationing function of prices and the invisible hand, where it is the competitive forces of buyers attempting to maximize utility, while simultaneously sellers are trying to maximize profit, which ultimately determines what economists refer to as market equilibrium. In our introductory course, we generally speak of three types of markets. The first is the one you're most familiar with, product markets. So these are the products and services that people buy, households, individuals. We purchase all the time. So we go shopping for food, we go shopping for repair service to our automobiles, we go shopping for dental services to get our teeth clean, we go shopping for any type of online services for our entertainment, such as Netflix and YouTube TV and such. So product markets are the ones we're most familiar with. In the most familiar market, products and services, the buyers are households/individuals, and the sellers are businesses. The next type of market would be the resource market: land, capital, and labor. Remember, in an economy that we label free market capitalism, we have private ownership of the economic resources. So in the market for resources, the buyers are businesses and the sellers are ultimately households. Households own the means of production. The last type of market are financial markets. We're not going to spend a great deal of time on these markets. However, when you study international economics and you study the economics of David Ricardo and international trade, one specific financial market becomes important, and that is the currency markets. Students often make the mistake of saying, we're learning supply and demand. Yes, supply and demand will be covered in detail in this lecture. However, supply and demand are the tools used by economists to analyze markets. So let's think big picture first. This is a graph of any market where there are a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. Like stated before, the interaction of the market participants determine the outcome, and the outcome is referred to as equilibrium by economists. Notice what's being measured on each axis. The vertical axis measures the price of the good or service, or the price of the resource that we are considering. On the horizontal axis, we're measuring quantity. So our downward sloping red demand curve displays the various amounts of a good, a service, or a resource that buyers are willing and able to purchase, series of prices, specified amount of time, other things equal. The upward sloping blue supply curve demonstrates or displays the amount of a good or service or a resource that sellers are willing and able to make available for sale, other things equal, ceteris paribus, for the time being. We are most interested in price and quantity. Notice how P star and Q star are labeled on this graph. The ultimate goal of our study of markets is to identify equilibrium price and quantity in the market, and then use the tools of supply and demand to determine what happens to equilibrium when market events, market scenarios affect the buyers or sellers' habits. What is demand? Demand is a schedule of the various amounts of a good or service that buyers are willing and able to purchase, series of prices, specified amount of time. So other things equal, we're going to emphasize the idea that price is the most important determinant of quantity demanded. So we're going to look at the relationship between the price of a good, a service, or a resource and the amount that buyers are willing and able to purchase for a specified amount of time. Now the time won't be the same for every market. If we considered something like the agricultural market like corn or wheat or cotton, the market demand curve might display or demonstrate buyers' interests and habits for this week. As opposed to new automobiles, the time might be something like a month. But the demand shows us for now this relationship between price and quantity that buyers are willing and able to purchase. The law of demand. I fought the law and the law won. Law of demand says what? There's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. An inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. If there's a decrease in the price of a good, a service, or a resource, there will be an increase in quantity demanded. Quantity demanded will rise. If there's a rise or an increase in the price of a good, service, or resources, quantity demanded will fall. We're going to demonstrate this numerically with data of the demand schedule and graphically the downward sloping demand curve. But before we do that, let's talk about the economic rationale behind this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Generally, economists discuss 4 reasons why the law of demand exists. The first one is something you're all familiar with. It's called common sense. When you go buy something, when the price of that something declines, you're more apt to buy more of it. When the price of it goes up, you're probably going to buy less of it. So just good old common sense. The next idea is diminishing marginal utility. We discussed this briefly in the previous video when we looked at the marginal benefits curve. Diminishing marginal utility is the concept that as a human being, as you consume more of a good or service, it provides less and less utility. Think about going to see a movie. You pay to see a movie the first time, you're surprised, you're entertained, you laugh. You may actually go to the theater to purchase that same service again, but the second time you see it, it's not going to yield as much utility, happiness, satisfaction, gratification. And if you continue to spend your time at that movie, it would actually become negative where you would rather be doing something else with your time. So as you consume more of a good or a resource, as human beings consume more of any type of item, inevitably the utility declines. So when price decreases, people are apt to purchase more based on the utility they perceive from that good, service, or resource. The income and substitution effect. The first one is straightforward, easy to explain. Assume you are going to the supermarket to purchase turkey, and we'll say turkey lunch meat, and you're going to assume that it is $5 per pound because that's what it was last week, and you have $20. With your limited income, you can obviously consume or purchase 4 pounds of this particular food item. But what happens if the price falls to $4 per pound? Well, look what happened to your limited income. The income effect. Price down, quantity demanded increases. So you're able to purchase more at the lower price. We call this the income effect. Obviously, the opposite would happen if we started at price level 4 and increased price to 5. The substitution effect applies when or if consumers perceive there to be a relatively equal or substitute product for the product under consideration. So if we continue with our previous example of turkey, we say, okay, maybe turkey and roast beef or turkey and chicken. If you were going to the store, assuming that you were going to buy some turkey and some roast beef, and the price of turkey declines, you're probably going to substitute in a bit more of that and purchase less of the other item. So the substitution effect only applies when buyers can readily identify a substitute product that yields the same basic utility or happiness. So we can express the demand schedule numerically with the data as presented on the left, or graphically with our downward sloping demand curve. Both of these demonstrate the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, or the law of demand, which we just explained. Let's look on the left. This is one individual, one person, their demand schedule for this week, and it tells us the various amounts of bushels of corn that this person is willing and able to purchase at a series of prices. So again, the specified amount of time, other things equal, is 1 week. At $4 per bushel, this person is willing and able to purchase 20 bushels of corn this week. If price declines to say $2, there will be an increase in quantity demanded from 20 bushels per week to 55 bushels. This person will be willing and able to purchase more bushels of corn at the lower price. So we see this on the data on the left graphically. Remember that on the vertical axis we are measuring the price. On the horizontal axis we're measuring quantity. Our downward sloping demand curve demonstrates the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. We simply take our data and we graph our downward sloping demand curve. Now this is the demand schedule for demand curve for one individual. We're more interested though in, because we said this when we introduced our study of markets, a large number of buyers. To get from an individual's demand schedule to the market demand, we simply sum up the buying habits of all market participants. So if we are examining the market for corn, there's literally millions of buyers in the corn market, and our demand schedule will look highly similar to the individual's demand curve. That downward sloping demand curve demonstrating the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So purchasers of corn who use it to make high fructose corn syrup. Corn is used as an additive to make livestock feed. Corn is used by food producers to make crackers and such. And of course, individuals like you and I, we buy corn. So all the millions of buyers. This important idea though, a change in price causes a movement along a single demand curve. Other things equal, price is the most important determinant of quantity demanded. So price of corn decreases, an increase in quantity demanded. Price of corn increases, a decrease in quantity demanded. This idea that a change in price causes a movement along a single demand curve. So we've been explaining why price is the most important determinant of quantity demanded and how a change in price causes a movement along a single demand curve. Now we're going to talk about the 5 non-price determinants of demand. These will end up shifting the curve, causing a completely different relationship between price and quantity demanded, a change in demand as opposed to a change in quantity demanded, and either an increase or a decrease in demand. We're going to see this graphically on the next few slides. The 5 non-price determinants of demand are taste and preferences, number of buyers, buyer's income. We will spend some time differentiating between normal goods and inferior goods. Price of related goods, we'll talk about substitute products and complementary products. And then we'll talk about expectations about future product price, future product availability, and future income. So let's now examine how these 5 non-price determinants of demand will cause a shift to the demand curve. Either an increase, a rightward shift to the demand curve, or a decrease, a leftward shift to the demand curve. So we're no longer talking about a change in quantity demanded caused by a change in price. Now something other than price has changed, and we're going to talk about a whole new relationship between price and quantity demanded. So a rightward shift to the demand curve is an increase in demand. Let's assume for the moment we're still analyzing the corn market. We'll go through the 5 non-price determinants and give some examples of how the demand curve will shift from D to D1, an increase in demand. So the first non-price determinant is taste and preferences. Let's assume you wake up tomorrow morning and there's an article in every major newspaper across the country that eating more corn reduces your chance of contracting certain types of cancer by 29%. That would increase people's preference to consume corn. Incentives matter, increase in demand. Rightward shift. Now, increase in the number of buyers. When the price of oil skyrocketed and the price of gasoline followed quickly after, Americans were looking for any alternative, and ethanol became an option. Ethanol is a fuel that's extracted from corn. So huge increase in the demand for corn, rightward shift, because you have a whole new group of buyers in the market for corn. These companies buying corn just to make this biodiesel. All right, number 3, increase in buyer's income. So generally speaking, when there's an increase in buyer's income, you'll have a rightward shift for most goods and services. Notice how it says normal good in parentheses there. So when you talk about an expanding economy causing unemployment to fall, expanding economy, unemployment falling, wages rising, people doing better, we generally buy more of most things. Right? So a decrease in buyers' income is generally then caused by a recession, a decline in aggregate output for the nation, and unemployment going up, and people becoming dependent on unemployment benefits and losing portion of their purchasing power. That would cause a decrease in buyers' income. But the caveat here is normal goods. So let's assume corn is a normal good and there's an increase in buyers' income. We would expect a rightward shift in the demand for corn, an increase in demand. Now, assume for a moment we were analyzing the market for an inferior good. So what is an inferior good? An inferior good would be something such as generic or store brand items, retreaded tires, used cars. These are what we call inferior goods. So make certain when you are analyzing a market, if there's a change in buyer's income, first to identify, are you analyzing a market for a normal good, which where the case would be increase in income, increase in buyer's income causes a rightward shift in demand and increase, or if it's an inferior good, the opposite would be true. All right, let's talk about substitute products. Now, for some people, this might not be the case, but let's assume for the moment that potatoes and corn are substitutes. So if there's an increase in the price of potatoes, a substitute product for corn, other things equal, nothing, the price of corn hasn't changed, there'll be an increase in the demand for corn based on the increase in the price of a substitute product. Now, expectations. If for some reason the producers of livestock or the manufacturer of high fructose corn syrup were worried about the future availability of corn. So there's some type of news article saying that, the next year's crop's not going to be a good output for whatever reason. There could be an increase in demand now based on the worry of future availability for corn. Let's quickly review how the 5 non-price determinants of demand will shift the curve to the right, increase demand. We're going to look at number 1, 2, 3, and 5, and then examine number 4 a little more carefully because we actually didn't discuss that one yet. So an increase in the taste or preference for any good or service will shift the demand curve to the right, increase in demand. Increase in the number of buyers will increase demand. Increased demand will also be caused if there's an increase in buyer's income, number 3, assuming that we're analyzing a market for a normal good. Number 5, expectations. So there's 3 types of expectations. Expectations about future product price, expectations about future product availability, and expectations about future income. So if consumers expect higher prices in the future, there will be an increase in demand now, a rightward shift in demand for this good or service. If consumers are worried about the availability of the product in the near future, there'll be an increase in demand for the product now. And if consumers expect higher income in the future, there's going to be an increase in the demand for the product now. Let's examine number 4, the one we didn't mention on the previous slide, complementary goods. So when you buy a cell phone, you use apps with it. When you play tennis, you use tennis balls and tennis rackets. When you go skiing, you use skis and ski boots and lift tickets. We call these complementary goods, goods and or services that are used in conjunction with one another. So let's assume we're analyzing the market for apps for smartphones. So, okay, we're analyzing the market for apps for smartphones. What happens in the market for apps for smartphones when there's a decrease in the price of smartphones? So a decrease in the price of a complementary good will increase the demand for the other good in questions. So price of smartphones down, increase in demand for apps. Let's examine how the 5 non-price determinants of demand would shift the demand curve to the left, decrease demand. So same 5 non-price determinants, but in this case a leftward shift in demand, decrease in demand. So we started D, and we're shifting to D1 because of something other than price changing in the market. What happens if you wake up tomorrow and there's a news story that eating too much corn could actually be linked to Alzheimer's disease? Well, that would not be good. So that would decrease the demand, decrease in the taste and preference, our first non-price determinism. After the price of oil plummeted in 2009, lots of buyers left the market because ethanol was no longer an economically viable substitute for gasoline because the price of gasoline plummeted so much. So if you look at number 2, the number of buyers, decrease in number of buyers, the leftward shift in demand. Let's assume for a moment that corn is still a normal good. Decrease in buyers' income shifts the demand curve to the left, decrease in demand. Obviously, if we assumed corn was an inferior good, this would be the opposite. But for now, we're going to assume that corn is a normal good. There's a decrease in buyers' income. We buy a little bit less corn. Now remember, this isn't just individuals buying corn. Remember, corn is used to make high fructose corn syrup. So perhaps those companies don't buy as much corn during a recession when the income is down. All right, price of a substitute. So again, assume that corn and potatoes are substitutes, and there's a decrease in the price of potatoes. So the price of corn has not changed, but a substitute, potatoes, has gone down in price, decrease in the demand for corn, and expectations of lower future prices. So let's assume that the manufacturers of livestock and the creators and makers of food items that purchase corn, that they can postpone their purchase of corn this month, and they expect the price of corn to go down next month based on information in the agricultural market. There'll be a decrease in demand right now. So quickly reviewing our 5 non-price determinants of demand and how they could decrease demand. A decrease in the taste and preference for any good or service will shift the demand curve to the left, decrease in demand. A decrease in the number of buyers will shift the demand curve to the left, decrease in demand. Buyers' income, assuming that we're analyzing the market for a normal good, decrease in buyers' income, decrease in demand. And expectations that the price will be lower in the future, decrease in demand now. Expectations that future income will decline, decrease in demand now. And expectations that there'll be plenty of a good or a service available in the future, decrease in demand now. The one we need to review a bit more detail is number 4, price of a complementary good. So let's go back to the one we were analyzing earlier. Let's say that we're analyzing the market for apps, that is to say, apps that we use on our smartphones. If the price of smartphones increases, complementary good, there'll be a decrease in demand for apps because they are complementary goods to smartphones. Okay, econ students, before we move on to our study of supply, review the 5 non-price determinants of demand. Make certain you understand how these non-price determinants will either increase or decrease demand. Launching our investigation of the other side of the market, supply explained, supply defined, the supply schedule examination. What is supply? The various amounts of a good or a service or resource that producers or sellers are willing and able to make available for sale, a series of prices, specified amount of time, other things equal. We will be able to express the supply schedule with data and graphically, similar as we did with demand. Here's a key to understanding supply. As buyers in market, we are conditioned to think of price as obstacles. We have to put on our seller's hat and think of price as reward. So price is no longer obstacle. Price is reward when you are the producer or seller of goods, services, and resource. That leads to what's called the law of supply, the direct relationship between price and quantity supply. So if price in the market goes up, we will see an increase in quantity supplied. When price declines, a decrease in quantity supplied. There's only one reason for this. If you're the producer and you think about manufacturing any good or service, you need to incur costs, land, labor, and capital associated with producing that type of output. You're willing and able to take on more cost when the price of the product you are selling or the service you are providing increases, and when prices of the good or service or that you produce are declining, you're going to look for ways to shed costs. So that's the rationale for the law of supply. Here is an individual supply curve for one farmer in the market for corn. So we see this upward sloping supply curve and the data supporting the curve on the right. So for this farmer, for this week, right, because remember, supply represents the various amounts of a good or service that the producer is willing and able to make available for sale, specified amount of time. So this is the supply for this week, other things equal, at a price of $3 per bushel. This farmer is willing and able to make available 35 bushels per week. If price goes up, increase in quantity supplied, price increases from $4 per bushel, from $3 per bushel to $4 per bushel, quantity supply will increase from 35 to 50, the upward sloping supply curve. But remember, we're interested in analyzing large number of sellers, large number of buyers. So let's talk about market supply. Similar to demand, we simply take all the habits of all the producers. We sum them all together, and that gets us to the market supply. So let's assume that this upward sloping supply curve reflects the direct relationship between price and quantity supplied in the corn market. So for all farmers, an increase in the price, increase in quantity supplied, a decrease in price, a decrease in quantity supplied. So other things equal, change in price causes a movement along a single supply curve. So just like there are non-price determinants of demand, there are non-price determinants of supply. When something other than price changes, how will it either increase supply or decrease supply, creates a whole new relationship between price and quantity supplied. There are 6 non-price determinants of supply, but the 4 on the board at the moment are the most important: resource prices, technology, taxes and subsidies, number of sellers. We will discuss to some extent price expectations and price of other goods. Let's investigate the important 4 first. So first, when we talk about resource prices, economists use the terms economic inputs, factors of production, or resources to mean the same thing. So get familiar with that terminology. Resources, inputs, factors of production. The land, capital, and labor that producers need when they are manufacturing goods and services. So if the price of any necessary inputs or factor of production, if the price of resources increase, that will cause a decrease in supply. If manufacturers pay less for resources or price of resources declines, that will cause an increase in supply. Now, typically technology is a good thing in terms of it advancing, it moving forward, it becoming better. So normally when we talk about how technology changes supply, we talk about an improvement in technology shifting the supply curve to the right, an increase in supply. There can be a temporary disruption to technology, which could shift the supply curve to the left, a decrease in supply. Taxes and or subsidies. Most people are familiar with taxes. The government taxes manufacturers, both at the state level and at the federal level. There's an old economic adage: if you want more of something, tax it less. If you want less of something, tax it more. Any increase in taxes will shift the supply curve to the left. Any decrease in taxes will shift the supply curve to the right. So increased taxes, decrease in supply, decreased taxes, increase in supply. What are subsidies? This may be a term you're not quite as familiar with. You can think of subsidies as taxes in reverse. The government actually collects tax revenues from one source and will subsidize certain industries. Currently, wind, solar, geothermal, all of these newer alternative cleaner energy, renewable energy sources are receiving subsidies from the government to incentivize more production of these type of energy sources. So an increase in subsidies will shift the supply curve to the right, increase in supply. If the government were to cut subsidies, decrease in supply. Number of sellers is the easiest one to explain. If more producers enter the industry, more firms enter the market, rightward shift, increase in supply. If firms exit the industry, a decrease in supply. Now the last 2, as I said, aren't quite as relevant, not quite as relevant as the other 4, but we'll discuss them. So price expectations. So a manufacturer might decide on increasing or decreasing supply today, based on expectations of prices in the future. So if producers expect higher prices for the good or service that they are selling in the future, there could be a decrease in supply today. And if they expect lower prices in the future, there could be an increase in supply today. The last one, price of other goods. If a manufacturer has the ability to efficiently alter output of different types of production without incurring incredibly increase in cost. So for instance, if a farmer has 40 acres and plants on 35 acres and leaves 5 to be renewed every year, and then basically splits the other 35 between corn and soy. If the farmer expects the price of one good to increase relative to the other good, right, they will increase the supply of the product they believe will go up in price. And vice versa, there would be a decrease in supply of the product where they believe that the price will go down. After introducing the 6 non-price determinants of supply, let's examine how they will shift the curve, either increase or decrease the supply curve. In this case, we're going to talk about a rightward shift of the supply curve, an increase in supply. So how do these 6 non-price determinants of supply increase supply, rightward shift the supply curve? If you're the producer, the manufacturer, all the firms in the industry, you have to pay for the factors of production, the economic inputs, the resources necessary to manufacture goods and services. Any decrease in the price of resources will shift the supply curve to the right. So if we're the farmer and the price of fertilizer declines, rightward shift in the supply curve. Any improvement in technology will shift the curve to the right. So any new methodology that can be implemented into the production process, which improves productivity, will shift the supply curve to the right. In the agricultural industry, a good example of this would be some extremely intelligent botanist at the University of Wisconsin develops a new type of seed which is more resilient to harsh weather and is able to withstand harsher weather conditions. That would be an improvement in technology, a rightward shift in supply. Number of sellers is simple, so there's more sellers in the market, a rightward shift in the supply curve. Taxes and subsidies. Let's analyze these separately. So manufacturers pay taxes, producers pay taxes at both the state and federal level. Let's talk federal taxes for the time being. So if there's a decrease in the price of taxes that manufacturers pay, decrease in taxes that manufacturers pay, there's an old economic adage, if you want more of something, tax it less. If you want less of something, tax it more. Any decrease in taxes will shift the supply curve to the right. Remember, subsidies. Think of subsidies as taxes in reverse. The federal government collects taxes from all kinds of sources and then will subsidize certain industries. Agriculture has been subsidized in the past. Industries receiving subsidies today include wind and solar, geothermal energy, so our renewable, cleaner energies. The government's trying to incentivize more production of those types of output. So any increase in subsidies will shift the supply curve to the right. Now, expectations of lower prices and the 6-1 decrease price of other goods. As I said, these aren't quite as relevant as the other 4. But if you're a manufacturer and you expect the price of the product you're producing or the service you're providing to decline in the future, you may be incentivized to increase supply today. And number 6, this only applies if a producer or manufacturer can easily shift resources between 2 different types of output. So it does lend itself to the agricultural industry analysis. If you're a farmer and you can plant both soy and corn, so you're thinking, okay, should we plant soy or corn, and you're thinking the price of soy is going to decline, then you'd be probably incentivized to grow or plant more corn. Rightward shift in supply. Examining the same 6 non-price determinants of supply, but in this instance we're going to be talking about examining a leftward shift in supply, a decrease in the supply curve, the market supply. So if manufacturers have to pay more for the factors of production the economic inputs, the resources, there'll be a leftward shift in supply. So using the same example as a previous slide, but in this case from the opposite direction, if all farmers had to pay more for fertilizer, decrease in supply. Normally we talk about technology being a good thing and improving. There could be a disruption to technology. So in the agricultural industry, this might be something such as, the GPS system that is used by farmers in the industry to track the best time to plant or the harvest is somehow off the grid for some time. That would cause a leftward shift in the supply curve. So any disruption to technology, typically a temporary issue, but could cause a leftward shift in supply. Number of sellers, if there's fewer sellers in the market, leftward shift in supply, decrease in the number of sellers. If the federal government were to increase taxes on farmers, leftward shift in supply. If we decrease subsidies to manufacturers, decrease in supply. Now this one's interesting. What if manufacturers expect higher prices of the good they produce or the service they provide in the future? They may be apt to take some of that off the market today and wait to make it available in the future. All right, last one, price of other goods. Again, if you're the farmer, you can easily shift resources. Assume you have 20 acres to plant and you're going to plant 18 acres and leave 2 vacant for next year to rest up, 9 of soy and 9 of corn. If you expect the price of soy to be higher, you're probably going to plant less corn. Increase in the price of the soy will decrease the supply of corn. Again, it's important to master these non-price determinants of supply. So challenge yourself, review the 6 non-price determinants of supply, make certain that you have a firm understanding of these, because we're going to bring demand and supply together and now talk about market equilibrium. After a thorough examination of the demand side of the market and the supply side of the market, let's bring demand and supply together and talk about the all-important idea of the rationing function of prices, the invisible hand, and equilibrium. So let's look at the prices of corn this week, somewhere between $1 and $5 per bushel, and then investigate the red market demand for corn and the blue market supply for corn. Let's first start at a high priced $4 per bushel. Let's talk about what's happening at $4 per bushel. At $4 per bushel, demand is mediocre, not a little bit tepid. Buyers are willing and able to purchase only 4,000 bushels of corn this week. At $4 per bushel, however, sellers have a little bit more incentives. They're willing and able to make available for sale 10,000 bushels of corn this week. That's not going to be a market clearing price. What's going on at $2 per bushel? Well, buyers are much more incentivized to purchase corn at $2 per bushel. Buyers are willing and able to purchase 11,000 bushels of corn. Sellers aren't so excited about making corn available for sale. They're willing and able to make available only 4,000 bushels. So at $4 per bushel, we would have a market surplus of 6,000 bushels of corn. The difference between the 10,000 bushels supplied and the 4,000 bushels demanded. At $2 per bushel, we'd have a market shortage. The difference between the 11,000 bushels demanded and the 4,000 bushels supplied. So what happens that brings us to equilibrium? Well, buyers are attempting to maximize utility. They're going to weigh the marginal benefits of consuming the next unit of corn versus the marginal cost of how their income could have spent otherwise. Sellers are trying to maximize profits, understanding that they have to cover their cost of production. So in Adam Smith's terms, as if led to by an invisible hand, we end up at this equilibrium. This week in the market, the price of corn is $3 per bushel, and the number of bushels bought and sold is 7,000 bushels. We can also call this the rationing function of prices. The idea that at $4, we didn't have a market clearing price because quantity supplied exceeded quantity demanded, and at $2, the opposite was taking place. Quantity demanded exceeded quantity supplied. So prices act as the market mechanism which lead us to this most efficient outcome for the time being. $3 per bushel, 7,000 bushels bought and sold. couple ideas are important here. Number one, remember, equilibrium is a starting point, not the end-all be-all. This is a temporary situation. Number two, Adam Smith wrote about this in The Wealth of Nations. Market clearing price, the invisible hand, does not mean everyone's happy. It's the most efficient outcome for society as far as benefits from consuming this product and how resources are allocated. But there were sellers who were waiting for the price to go above the equilibrium who did not sell, and buyers who wanted the price to be below the equilibrium who did not get to purchase corn. But it's the most efficient outcome from society standpoint. Let's look at this graphically. So here we have the exact price, $3 per bushel, and the exact quantity, 7, this is in thousands, 7,000 bushels. So right at this stage of the game, this time, this week, the market clearing price is $3 per bushel, 7,000 bushels of corn bought and sold. So at equilibrium, we have this situation where quantity demanded is aligned with quantity supplied. This idea of the market clearing price, the idea of the rationing functional prices that for the time being we're at rest here, the idea that prices will be the mechanism which adjusts buyers and sellers' behavior. If price were set above the equilibrium or below the equilibrium, it's going to create a market surplus or a market shortage. Let's discuss surpluses and shortages in more detail. Let's assume for a moment that the government artificially inflates price above the equilibrium price of $3 per bushel. Let's assume that the government holds price at $4 per bushel. We call this a price floor. The government says we will not allow the price to go below $4 per bushel. First, who is the government attempting to assist with their intervention in markets, altering what economists believed was an efficient outcome? Obviously, the sellers are happier at this price because they were forced to accept $3 per bushel prior to the intervention of government in the market. Now price is raised above the equilibrium price. At the price floor, what is the economic outcome or result? A market surplus. Look at the difference between quantity supplied at $4 per bushel and quantity demanded at $4 per bushel. Sellers are willing and able to make available for sale 10,000 bushels. Buyers, on the other hand, only willing and able to purchase 4,000 bushels. Economists refer to that difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded at $4 per bushel, that 6,000 bushel difference, as a market surplus. Now, in the real world, how does this play out? First, why would the government do this? Well, the United States has a history of assisting farmers, especially when we had mom and pop shops. You may have read The Grapes of Wrath and heard about the struggles of the agricultural industry, which sort of stammered through the 20s and then collapsed in the 1930s, and lots of farmers losing their property. The idea is that we need to provide a safe wage or an adequate income for farmers to incentivize to keep at it in the agricultural industry, and to ensure on a larger scale a safe and adequate food source for America. So when farms were owned by individuals, this made a good deal of economic sense. However, most of the farming is now large multi-billion-dollar agri-corporations. So we're actually end up putting a price floor in agricultural industries, which is putting the money back in the hands of corporations when price floors are triggered, and there still are actual price floors in the agricultural industry. So what are the secondary economic effects of said policy? Well, what do we do with that 6,000 bushel surplus? Well, we have two choices. We could pay producers not to produce, and then it would just not exist. But most of the time, the United States government gives away this surplus as foreign direct aid to emerging economies or countries which may be struggling, which sounds like a wonderful thing. But if you're a farmer in Africa, what price can you not compete with? You can't compete with zero or free. So if you're the foreign farmer in a different continent and you've already taken on the cost of production, the land, capital, and labor, that was necessary to grow an agricultural output, and all of a sudden the United States dumps bushels and bushels of corn into your market that is selling for free because it's being given away, that crushes the local producers. Away from the corn market for a moment and use a different market to explain the economic rationale behind price ceilings. In this case, the government steps in and says, we will not let the price go above a certain rate or a certain level. But let's assume for a moment that we're now analyzing the market for apartments in New York City, and the $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 on the price vertical axis are in thousands of dollars. So this is how much people will pay in rent for an apartment in New York City. And for simplicity, we will say 800 square foot apartments. So the market price of an 800 square foot apartment, the monthly rental fee would be $3,000. That's what the 3 represents. And there'd be 700,000 units available for rent. That's the market clearing, invisible hand, efficient outcome. But in this case, the government steps into the market and says, we're going to help low income individuals and households by keeping the price below the market clearing $3,000 per rental per month, right? Now, how does this shortage play out? Well, first, what is the shortage? In number terms, the difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied at this price ceiling of $2,000. So quantity demanded 11,000, quantity supplied 4,000. We can think of those as 1.1 million and 400,000. So we have a shortage of 700,000 units. You might ask yourself, well, it's not like these units just disappear. How does it, it's not like the physical properties, the buildings no longer exist. Well, here's what happens. In the short run, the owner of the building, the landlord, is going to look for ways to recoup that loss. So for simplicity, let's assume that we own a building and there's 100 units in our building. 100 times 3, so we were collecting 300,000 in revenue each month, because 100 units times 3,000 per unit, we were collecting 300,000 in total revenue for our building. But now with the new government price ceiling, right, this rent control price, our revenue has been cut. It's been cut from 300,000 down to 200,000. So we look for ways to recoup that by no longer providing free heat for tenants, or we maybe let the building become dilapidated. But here's how that shortage plays out in the long run. Building owners realize there's a loophole. Let's assume that we don't want to be an apartment building anymore. We'll convert our units to condominiums. We'll send all the tenants nice letters saying, you've been an excellent tenant. We're going to give you an opportunity to purchase this apartment as a condominium, but when your lease is over, we are not going to renew the lease. And that's exactly what happened in cities across the country when governments instituted these rent control prices, and that's how the shortage actually plays out in the long run. We have established a basic background understanding of market economics. We defined or explained the demand schedule. We understand that price is the most important determinant of quantity demanded, other things equal. We examine the 5 non-price determinants of demand, or the demand shifters. Likewise, we explained the supply schedule, understanding that price is the most important determinant of quantity supplied. Then we examine the 6 non-price determinants of supply, or the supply shifters. We can use our economic knowledge to analyze market scenarios. So again, a market is an institution which brings together buyers and sellers, and the interactions of lots and lots of buyers, lots and lots of sellers. So we're going to assume there's a large number of buyers, large number of sellers, brings us to equilibrium. Our job now is to determine what happens to equilibrium price and quantity in a market when some event affects the habits of buyers or sellers, or in the rare case, when a market event influences some change to both demand and supply. So here we have four graphs, A, B, C, and D. The first two analyze changes to demand and how that affects equilibrium price and quantity. The second two examine how changes in supply affect equilibrium price and quantity. Definitely a good idea to familiarize yourself with the shifts of the curve and how they affect equilibrium price and quantity. Remember, the most important aspect of our economic exercise in regards to markets is to identify what's going on with equilibrium price and quantity and determine how shifts in demand and or supply affect price and quantity. So let's examine graph A, for instance. We start at D1 and S, that's our initial equilibrium. Then you can see something causes a rightward shift in the demand curve. So an increase in the taste and preferences, an increased number of buyers. We went over these events prior. An increase in demand will increase the equilibrium price in the market and increase quantity. Graph B, the opposite's going on. We started at D1 and S, but in this case, there's a decrease in demand, a leftward shift in demand curve, which will drive down equilibrium price and decrease equilibrium quantity. Down bottom on the left, graph C, we have an initial equilibrium at S1D, and then something occurs which shifts the supply curve to the right. An increase in supply causes equilibrium price to decline and equilibrium quantity to increase. And then last but not least, a decrease in supply down bottom of the right, graph D. We start at S1D, and then some event occurs like a decrease in the number of sellers, which shifts the supply curve to the left. Familiarize yourself with these four graphs. We're going to use our 5 non-price determinants of demand and our 6 non-price determinants of supply to perform market scenario analysis and determine how changes in buyers' behavior, events that affect sellers, or both influence equilibrium price and quantity. Thus far, we've done an excellent job of introducing the principles of markets by explaining in detail the tools of demand and supply and what factors would ultimately shift demand or supply, affecting equilibrium price and quantity in the market. Often students will be asked to use market analysis and the tools of supply and demand to determine what happens to equilibrium price and quantity in a market when an event affects either demand or supply. So if we look at this graph, a couple important ideas are worth emphasizing. First, remember, price in any market is measured on the vertical axis. Quantity is measured on the horizontal axis. The downward sloping demand curve represents the buyers in the market. The upward sloping supply curve represents the sellers. For now, this market is at equilibrium at E1 with a certain price, P1, and a certain quantity, Q1. When asked to perform these market analysis scenarios, must follow 4 steps. First, identify the market. So the question might ask you about the market for timber, copper, might ask you about the market for wheat, might ask you about the market for services to get automobiles repaired. So it could be limitless. It could be a resource market, it could be a product market, it could be a service market, but you must identify the market first. Second, when you are presented with the scenario, you must identify what's going on in the event and how is that going to impact or affect one of the 5 non-price determinants of demand or the 6 non-price determinants of supply. After you've completed task number 2, then you'll identify the shift in demand or supply. You'll label on the graph whether demand increased or decreased, or whether supply increased or decreased. We will go over the rare cases when 2 events affect the market simultaneously, one affecting demand and one affecting supply, but for now we'll just leave that on the back burner. And then ultimately your job is to determine, after the shift of the curve, after identifying what happens to demand or supply, ultimately determine what's the impact on equilibrium price and quantity in the market after the event affects either buyers or sellers. Before we begin our analysis of specific market scenarios, let's discuss in general terms how Changes in demand and or changes in supply will affect equilibrium price and quantity in the market. So here's any market. We're at equilibrium E1 with P1 and Q1. Price to market, quantity to market. Remember, equilibrium is a temporary state. There's always events, factors, which are altering buyers and sellers' behavior. So in this case, let's assume something happens which alters the demand such that there's an increase in demand. The demand curve shifts to the right. At our new equilibrium E2, we'll see that there'll be an increase in the quantity and an increase in the price of this market. Remember, most important economic observation of market analysis is to determine what ultimately happens to equilibrium price and quantity. Again, we start at Q1, P1. Our market always have our supply curve and our demand curve, our buyers, our sellers and our buyers. And what happens? In this case, some factor, one of the 5 non-price determinants, affects market such that demand decreases. When there's a decrease in demand, demand shifts to the left. Equilibrium is no longer at E1, it's at E2. At the new equilibrium, price has dropped and quantity has decreased as well. Now let's talk about some changes in supply. Always start out by drawing a supply curve and demand curve. Use your current equilibrium, E1. We have a price in the market, we have quantity in the market. One of the 6 non-price determinants of supply increases supply. Supply curve shifts to the right. At our new equilibrium, we have a lower price in the market and an increase in quantity. Finally, we talk about what happens if we started E1, P1, and some factor, one of the non-price determinants of supply, shifts the supply curve to the left. At our new equilibrium E2, price up, quantity down. Make certain you review the 5 non-price determinants of demand and the 6 non-price determinants of supply. It's going to be essential to your market analysis skills that you are comfortable and competent in those economic ideas. After identifying the 5 non-price determinants of demand and the 6 non-price determinants of supply, and how changes in one of the 5 non-price determinants in demand or 6 non-price determinants of supply ultimately affect market equilibrium, it's time to embrace what economists refer to as complex cases. Suppose there's a market analysis, and in the market scenario, one event or factor affects demand. At the same time, another event or factor affects supply. So we have 2 simultaneous events affecting the same market, one impacting or influencing supply or sellers, the other factor influencing buyers or demand. When that is the case, one of our variables, price or quantity, will ultimately have what economists refer to as an indeterminate result. In other words, there's not enough information in the scenario to ultimately determine what happens to one of our variables. This idea will become more clear as we go through some examples. The next 2 slides outline the ideas, and when we analyze some market scenarios, the examples will solidify your understanding. So assume we're analyzing a market, and in that market, one event happens which causes supply to increase. So there's a decrease in the price of resources, which shifts the supply curve to the right. At the same time, another factor causes demand to decrease. So there's a decrease in the number of buyers. First key idea, whenever analyzing a market scenario where 2 events affect the market simultaneously, one affecting demand and the other affecting supply, it's vitally important to draw 2 separate graphs of the same market. You can't try to represent both the supply change and the demand change on the same graph. And the reason being, we don't know the magnitude of the shifts. Now in this scenario, if one event causes supply to increase, while another factor causes demand to decrease, at the same time in the same market, ultimately this will drive equilibrium price of that good, service, or resource up, but the quantity will be indeterminate. There could be a scenario where supply decreases and demand increases. So what would cause supply to decrease? All right, if there's an increase in the tax on producers, one of the non-price determinants of supply, or a decrease in subsidies, that would cause supply to decrease. At the same time, demand increases. So this good, service, or resource becomes more popular or necessary for the buyers. If those two events happen simultaneously in the same market, one of causing supply to decrease and the other causing demand to increase, we would know that for certain price would increase, but in this case quantity would be indeterminate. Again, why indeterminate? There's simply not enough detailed information in the market scenario to know the magnitude of the shifts of the curve. We don't know if supply decreased by just a marginal amount or a significant amount, or demand increased by goo gobs or just a tiny fraction. Of course, there are two other scenarios possible with complex cases. It could be such that in the market for a certain good or service or a resource, one factor causes supply to increase and another event causes demand to increase. If that were the scenario, ultimately price would be indeterminate and quantity would increase. Or the last possibility, in the same market at the same time, one factor or event causes supply to decrease, another causes demand to decrease, ultimately resulting in price being indeterminate in the market and quantity decreasing. Do not attempt to memorize the four possible scenarios of complex cases. Instead, fall back on your understanding of the 5 non-price determinants of demand, the 6 non-price determinants of supply. Draw 2 graphs of the same market whenever confronted with a market scenario that has 2 factors simultaneously affecting the market, and then make your economic observation to determine the ultimate change in price or quantity, understanding that definitely one of the 2 variables will ultimately be labeled indeterminate because we simply don't know the magnitude or size of the shifts of the curve. As with many interesting and challenging academic pursuits, the best approach to becoming expert is to work through several examples to be comfortable with the material. Let's take that approach to become experts on market economics, understanding the 5 non-price determinants of demand and the 6 non-price determinants of supply will ultimately affect equilibrium price and quantity in the markets. Scenario number 1, commercial real estate market. Thousands of businesses who rent commercial offices space begin to question the necessity of having all employees work in a common location, as the occupational efficiency of remote employees appears to maintain or exceed the level obtained in the office. COVID forced businesses to send labor home to work from their basement, their bedroom, their kitchen, some remote location. How will this reality ultimately affect the market for commercial real estate? Well, the first and most important approach to properly analyzing markets is to understand the 4-step process. Absolutely, positively, without a doubt, begin the market analysis process by drawing a graph. And notice here it's in capital letters. Draw a correctly labeled market graph. Make sure the vertical axis is labeled price, the horizontal axis is labeled quantity, the downward sloping demand curve is labeled D for demand, the upward sloping supply curve is labeled S for supply, and the point where supply and demand come together is labeled E for equilibrium. Draw your dotted lines signifying where equilibrium price and quantity is to start the markets. A good acronym for this approach is ACE your graph. A, axes. C, curves, in this case demand and supply curves. And E, equilibrium. ACE your graphs. After you have correctly drawn a supply and demand graph representing the buyers and sellers in the market. Be certain to label the market. It's vitally important to a correct market analysis to identify which market is being studied. After you've completed step 1 of the process, step 2, evaluate the information and identify the non-price determinant of demand or supply which is affecting the market. To begin our study, going to take the simple approach. These first few market scenarios will only have one event affecting either demand or supply. We'll revisit those complex cases soon enough. In this case, thousands of businesses renting commercial real estate prior to the pandemic now question the necessity to bring all those workers into the office. Seems to me there's going to be a significant decrease in the number of buyers in the market of commercial real estate. That's the non-price determinant of demand or supply, in this case demand. So a decreased number of buyers. Step 3, explain the change in demand or supply. So there's going to be a leftward shift, decrease in demand. And then you draw that onto the graph. You draw the leftward shift of the demand curve. Finally, most importantly, do not forget to determine the ultimate impact of the change in demand or supply on market equilibrium. Remember, the most important aspect of market analysis is to identify equilibrium price and quantity when you start the analysis, and then determine what happens to equilibrium price and quantity after some factor has shifted the supply or demand curve. All right, let's take all this information and now perform our graphical analysis. Graphical analysis of the commercial real estate market. Correctly labeled graph. Price labeled on the vertical axis. Quantity labeled on the horizontal axis. Downward sloping demand curve labeled D1. Upward sloping supply curve labeled S1. Where demand and supply come together. Equilibrium. P1, price in this scenario represents price per square footage of commercial real estate prior to the pandemic. Q1, quantity, total quantity of square footage rented per month prior to the pandemic. What happens in this market? There's a decrease in the number of buyers. Why? Businesses no longer feel the need to bring all the employees into the office. How will a decrease in the number of buyers and non-price determinant demand affect market equilibrium and quantity? Demand curve shifts to the left. At the new equilibrium E2, price and quantity decrease. The price per square footage of commercial real estate has gone down. Total amount of square footage rented per month has also decreased. Now, the two-dimensional graphical analysis is interesting, and I'm hoping you're mastering these skills. But also think about the real world. How is this going to affect livelihoods? Imagine if you own a large amount of commercial real estate. Wall Street Journal article recently described how owners of commercial real estate buildings are searching for ways to convert their office space to residential housing. Economic events create secondary effects. So yes, we get the basic market analysis. You did the problem correctly, but start to think this is not just a two-dimensional graph without real life implications. These are livelihoods affected by market scenarios in the real world. Second scenario, the market for vacuum cleaners. The price of electric motors, the main component of vacuum cleaners, increases significantly. How will this event affect the market for vacuum cleaners? Attempt this one on your own before skipping through to the next slide. 4-step process. Draw a correctly labeled graph. Ace your graph. Axes, curves, equilibrium. Identify the market. Figure out which non-price determinant of demand or supply is affecting this market. Then draw the shift in the demand or supply. And most importantly, identify how the change in demand or supply ultimately affected equilibrium price and quantity in the market. assuming you paused the video and challenged yourself to figure out this market scenario. Let's see how you did. The market vacuum cleaners, correctly labeled vertical axis and horizontal axis, P and Q, price and quantity respectively, downward sloping demand curve labeled D1, upward sloping supply curve labeled S1, equilibrium at E1, P1, Q1. If you deduced that the motors are a resource, an input, a factor of production, and that the increase in the price of a factor of production ultimately decreased supply, you were correct. So first, the market for vacuum cleaners. Second, increase in the price of a resource. Third, decrease in supply. The leftward shift in the supply curve, S to S2, at the new equilibrium E2, price in the market for vacuum cleaners increase, equilibrium quantity decreased. In the real world, it's possible tariffs are increasing the price of imported motors that domestic vacuum cleaner manufacturers are producing. Haven't gotten this far in the course, but begin to think how these type of scenarios affect people and livelihoods in the real world. Economics is a social science. If this type of event is happening in many manufactured products, driving prices up, this would have inflationary effects in the macroeconomic sense. Economic practice makes perfect market analysis. Next scenario to analyze, video game downloads. The price of video game consoles declined. How will this event affect the market for video game downloads? Take a minute or two, draw a correctly labeled graph of the market, identify the non-price determinant of demand or supply affecting this market, demonstrate the shift of the demand or supply on the graph, and determine the change in equilibrium price and quantity because of the market event. Let's see how we did, students. Correctly labeled graph, price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, equilibrium 1, P1, Q1. This is the price for video game downloads and the quantity of video game downloads bought and sold. The market is obviously video game downloads. What happened? In this scenario, video game consoles and video game downloads are complementary goods. So give yourself credit if you identified video game consoles as a complementary good. If the price of consoles declines, that's going to lead to an increase in the demand for video games. Decrease in the price of a complement increases the demand for the other good. Demand shifts from D1 to D2. And how does this ultimately affect equilibrium price and quantity in the market for video game downloads? There will be more video games downloaded, and the price of video game downloads will increase. This is good if you are a video game producer. One more example before moving on to complex cases. The last one was lighthearted in nature. This one's a tad more serious. ICE, or the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, deports hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants currently employed in the agricultural industry. How will this event affect the market for domestic agricultural products? Draw your correctly labeled graph. Make sure you identify the market. Identify the non-price determinant of demand or supply affecting this market. Demonstrate the shift of the curve on the graph. And determine how the change in demand or supply ultimately affects equilibrium price and quantity in the market for agricultural products. Whether it's politically expedient or necessary, the deportation of illegal immigrants is one of the tremendously difficult normative debates of our time. However, our job as positive economists, trying to be objective about this analysis, is to determine how the deportation of hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants working in the agricultural industry will affect the market for domestically produced agricultural products. Understanding that many individuals who are here illegally are picking uh, agricultural products and working in the agricultural industry. The market, agricultural products produced domestically. The non-price determinant. Be careful here. In this market, the demand is for labor. The demand are the farmers. The supply are the individuals willing and able to work in these agricultural jobs. If we deport hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants currently employed in the agricultural industry, there will be a decrease in supply. There will be a decrease in the number of sellers. That will shift the supply curve to the left. A decrease in supply will ultimately drive up the price and decrease the quantity of agricultural products in the United States. On a macro scale, this will be inflationary, and for the average everyday American, we will pay more for fruits and vegetable at the grocery store. Time to tackle a complex case. One event affecting demand, another event affecting supply, simultaneously in the same market. Remember, when analyzing a market scenario in which two events, one affecting demand, one affecting supply, occur simultaneously, it is imperative necessary to draw two graphs, one representing the supply change and one representing the demand change. Pandemic lockdowns encourage homeowners to tackle home improvement projects, increasing the need for plywood used for framing. All right, so the market is plywood. That seems like it's going to increase the number of buyers in the market as bored homeowners got nothing to do with their time. They can't go to the movies or to a concert or to the ballet or whatever type of social outings they typically enjoy because of lockdowns, so they might as well tackle some home improvement projects. At the same time, the price of particle board, the key component of producing plywood, increases. That sounds like an increase in the price of a resource. How will these two events affect the market for plywood? On the left-hand side, analyze the demand change. Start at E1, P1, Q1 with D1, S1 in the market for plywood. The increase in the number of buyers, increased demand, shifting the demand curve to the right from D1 to D2. At the new equilibrium price, P2, Q2, price in the market for plywood has increased and quantity has also increased. If this were the only event in the market, you'd be finished. That would be the final result. Price up, quantity up in the market for plywood. But it's not the only event affecting the market for plywood. At the same time, there's an increase in the price of particle board, key component in producing plywood. On the right-hand side, same drill. The market, plywood. Increase in the price of a resource, decreased supply. Notice equilibrium began at S1, D1, P1, Q1 on the right-hand side. Leftward shift in the supply curve, decrease in supply from S1 to S2. At the new equilibrium, E2, price up, quantity down. Now, when I was a kid, I watched Sesame Street, but now that I have nieces and nephews, actually they're older now, but when they were little, I got to watch Sesame Street again. There's so much adult humor in Sesame Street. You didn't enjoy it when you were 4, you just didn't get it. Remember that skit on Sesame Street? Which one of these things is not like the other? Evaluate both graphs. Determine what definitely happened. The increase in demand drove up the price of plywood. The decrease in supply drove up the price of plywood. So for certain, plywood prices increased. What about quantity? Well, the increase in demand increased quantity in the market, but the decrease in supply decreased quantity. Therefore, quantity, that variable, is indeterminate. From the information given in the problem, we just don't know. Was there a tremendous increase in demand and only a small decrease in supply, or vice versa? Were the magnitudes of the shift exactly equal? Not enough information to determine the magnitude of the shifts. Therefore, we know for certain price up, quantity indeterminate at final results. Make certain you label final results whenever presented with a market scenario with two events happening simultaneously. Probably best to secure our understanding of complex cases by evaluating one more. Remember, whenever presented with a market scenario in which one event is affecting demand and another event is affecting supply, absolutely positively imperative to draw two separate graphs. Let's read the scenario. Health conscious people cut back on consumption of candy. That's going to affect demand. The price of sugar, a necessary input to produce candy, decreases. How will these two events ultimately affect the candy markets? Let's break down health conscious people cutting back first. Left hand side graph, D1, S1, P1, Q1, equilibrium. Decrease in the taste or preference. Also could say decrease in number of buyers. Shifts demand from D1 to D2. The leftward shift in demand, price down, quantity down at the new equilibrium, E2. If that was the only event that happened, you would be finished. But at the same time, the price of sugar, a resource input factor of production, declines. Look at the right-hand side graph. You start at S1, D1, P1, Q1, and there's a rightward shift in supply. An increase in supply because there is a decrease in the price of a factor of production. At the new equilibrium, P2, Q2, price down, quantity up. Again, evaluate both graphs and changes to equilibrium simultaneously and determine which variable definitely moved in a specific direction. Both the decrease in demand on the left-hand side and the increase in supply on the right-hand side drove equilibrium price down. Price definitely lower, price down in the final determinant. What about quantity? The decrease in demand pushed quantity down. The increase in supply increased quantity. Again, because we don't know the magnitudes of the shifts, quantity is ultimately indeterminate. Again, make certain when evaluating a scenario with two simultaneous events that you label final results and make it clear what happened ultimately to price and quantity in the markets. The final concepts covered on this markets video are the principles of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Think of consumer surplus and producer surplus as a measure of the efficiency of competitive markets. What is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus measures the difference between a buyer's maximum willingness to pay for a product or service and what they are required to pay. Consider this downward sloping demand curve for concert tickets. In this example, the market price of a concert ticket is $20. The buyer represented here is willing and able to pay $80 for the concert ticket. For this individual, their maximum willingness to pay is $80. What they are required to pay, the market price, is $20, and the difference is their consumer surplus. 80 minus 20, $60. This buyer receives $60 worth of consumer surplus or additional utility by attending the concert. Just think of any time you visited a store or paid for an experience and said to yourself, I think I got a bargain. I would have paid more for the product or service. I was willing and able to pay above the market price, but I only had to pay the required market price. Economists are interested in measuring total consumer surplus. Consider the area on the graph below the demand schedule, above the equilibrium price. That triangle represents total consumer surplus. It measures all the buyers who are willing and able to purchase this service, in this case, concert experience, for a price above the equilibrium price of $20, but only paid the market price. The area on the graph below the demand schedule down to the equilibrium price and across the equilibrium quantity, as represented by the blue triangle, represents total consumer surplus. Taking the area of that triangle using 1/2 base times height allows economists to efficiently measure total consumer surplus. To calculate the total consumer surplus of the concert ticket market, take the maximum willingness to pay 80 minus the market price of 20, that's 60, times the total quantity in the market, 90. 60 times 90 is 5,400. 1/2 base times height. Therefore, the consumer surplus in the concert ticket markets is $2,700. One more example of consumer surplus. A cold, blustery Sunday in December, Philadelphia Eagles scheduled to play the New York Giants at 4 p.m. Tailgaters arriving early. Many of them forgot to pack warm weather clothes, and they're looking to purchase a hat. A vendor is roaming the macadam of the Lincoln Financial Field and Wells Fargo lots, offering hats for $6. What is the consumer surplus in this market? The maximum willingness to pay, $10, minus the market price of $6 times the market quantity of 20. 10 minus 6 is 4 times 20 is 80. But remember, area of a triangle, 1/2 the base times height. Therefore, the consumer surplus in this market is 40. Economics is a social science. Economists are proponents of the invisible hand and the rationing function of prices. Calculating consumer surplus is straightforward. The math is not difficult. The concept is far more important. Consumer surplus is a measure of the additional welfare or utility of competitive markets. It's the benefit that buyers receive simply by measuring the difference between what they are willing and able to pay for a good or service and the market price. Buyers are not the only market participants to benefit through voluntary exchange in markets. The invisible hand and the rationing function of prices. Competitive markets also bring efficiency gains to sellers. Economists refer to this concept as producer surplus. What is supply? The various amounts of a good, service, or resource that sellers are willing and able to make available for sale. Other things equal. Consider this upward sloping supply curve representing the market supply of oil. Some sellers are willing and able to accept a price per barrel below the current equilibrium price of $40. Why? In the real world, drilling for oil in Saudi Arabia costs less than drilling for oil in the United States. In Saudi Arabia, extracting oil involves drilling through relatively soft sand. In the United States, it is far more intensive with directional drilling and fracking through shale. Therefore, some sellers in this market would be willing and able to accept a price below the current equilibrium price of $40. Consider the blue area on the graph below representing the producer surplus gained by sellers who are willing and able to make this land resource available for sale at a price far below the equilibrium price of $40. Economists are interested in measuring total producer surplus, or the efficiency gains received by sellers in competitive markets, represented by the blue triangle on our oil market graph. 60 market quantity, 40 market price, 2,400, 1/2 base times height. The total producer surplus received by sellers in the oil market is 1,200. Did you ever attempt to purchase a product for lower than the advertised sticker price? Reconsider the market for winter hats in the Eagles tailgate scenario. On the graph below, the orange area represents total producer surplus. Some sellers would be willing and able to make these hats available for a price lower than the advertised $6. What is the total producer surplus in the market for winter tailgate hats? $6 minus $1 is 5. 5 times 20 is 100. 1/2 base times height. The total producer surplus in the market for Winter tailgate hats is therefore 50. Again, calculating producer surplus is straightforward. 1/2 base times height. Understanding the concept of producer surplus is far more important. Producer surplus is the efficiency gains received by sellers in competitive markets. It is the difference between what producers are willing and able to supply a good or price for and what they actually receive. Reconsider the supply curve. The upward sloping supply curve represents the various amounts of a good, service, or resources that sellers are willing and able to make available for sale, series of prices, specified amount of time, other things equal. In essence, it represents the marginal cost of producers of making the next unit of a good, service, or resource available for sale. As long as the marginal benefit producers receive from making that next unit available for sale is greater than the marginal cost, it makes sense for them to participate in the market transaction. The area of producer surplus represents the efficiency gains received by sellers through the invisible hand and the rationing function of prices in competitive markets. The combination of consumer surplus, represented by the gray triangle on the graph, and producer surplus, represented by the orange triangle on the graph, constitutes total economic surplus. Economists are proponents of the invisible hand and the rationing function of prices as competitive markets maximize total economic surplus. Why? The demand curve represents the marginal benefits consumers receive from purchasing goods or services. As long as the additional utility of the next unit of consumption is greater than how dollars could have been spent elsewhere, buyers will purchase the next unit. The upward sloping supply curve represents the marginal cost producers incur from acquiring land, capital, and labor to manufacture output. As long as the marginal revenue or price that sellers receive is greater than that marginal cost, the economic exchange makes sense from the seller's standpoint. At equilibrium, society achieves allocative efficiency. Scarce land, capital, and labor, limited resources are allocated just to the point where the marginal benefits of consumption received by buyers equals the marginal cost of production incurred by sellers. Competitive markets, through the rationing function of prices and the invisible hand, result in maximum economic surpluses, where the marginal benefit of the last unit consumed equals the marginal cost of how resources could have been used otherwise. Buyers attempting to maximize utility, sellers attempting to maximize profits, generates allocative efficiency. What happens when society underproduces or overproduces a good or service? Consider the graph on the left. The competitive outcome through the market forces of demand and supply results in an equilibrium quantity of 10 units. What happens if only 5 units are produced? Notice the yellow triangle. At 5 units of production, society is under-allocating scarce land, capital, and labor to the production of this good or service. The marginal benefits of the next units of consumption are greater than the marginal cost of how resources could have been used otherwise. Take note that the triangle represents efficiency loss, dead weight loss. Also notice that the triangle points to the allocative efficient quantity at market equilibrium of 10 units. Now consider the graph on the right hand side. Again, the efficient market outcome through the forces of demand and supply results in an equilibrium quantity of 10 units. What happens if society produces 12 units? At that level of output, the marginal cost of production is greater than the marginal benefits of how these resources could have been used elsewhere. Society is over-allocating scarce land, capital, and labor to the production of this good or service. Again, the yellow triangle represents the inefficiency or deadweight loss resulting from overallocation of resources to the production of this product, and the triangle of deadweight loss points to the allocatively efficient level of equilibrium quantity. Like many topics in an introductory economics course, the previous analysis of deadweight loss was an oversimplification of a complex economic situation. Let's consider some of the factors which generate deadweight loss in the real world. The first, government intervention in markets, aka price controls. A price ceiling is when a government sets a maximum price below the equilibrium price. The classic example of price ceiling, rent controls. In an effort to make rental units less expensive for low and middle income individuals and families, the government sets a rent control price below what would be the market price for rental units. This results in market shortages and has played out across urban settings across the United States whenever implemented. Price floors, setting a minimum price above the equilibrium price, which can create surpluses. The typical example of a price floor in the agricultural industry, the government has set a market price above equilibrium price, resulting in over allocation of resources and market surpluses in the farming industry. The next topic to consider, taxes and subsidies. Taxes increase the cost of goods and services, leading to reduced consumption and production, thus creating deadweight loss. Subsidies, you can think of subsidies as taxes in reverse, where the government takes tax revenues generated from one source and hands them out to industry players in a specific economic situation. The most recent example of subsidies and the possibility of the deadweight loss caused by government policy is the Biden CHIPS Act. In an effort to stimulate production, the subsidies can lead to overproduction and inefficient allocation of resources, leading to the deadweight loss. Monopolies, a situation where one producer, one firm, is the dominant player in a market, controls most of the industry. Monopolies restrict output and raise prices compared to a competitive market, leading to a loss of economic surplus. Most economists believe monopolies should come under a certain level of government scrutiny and should be subjected to some level of government regulation. Another popular topic at the moment, tariffs. Tariffs increase the price of imported goods, leading to reduced consumption and deadweight loss. Finally, but not the least important, as this topic will be investigated further down the road, market externalities. Negative externalities occur when production or consumption imposes costs on third parties. The classic example of a negative externality is pollution. Assume the market players, corporations, or companies are polluting the air or water and passing the cost of pollution onto the community at large. It may be the government's role to reallocate resources to correct this negative externality. Positive externalities occur when production or consumption creates benefits for third parties. The most recent example of a positive externality during the pandemic, Operation Warp Speed, government sent funds to pharmaceutical producers in an effort to expedite the production of a vaccination to treat the COVID-19 pandemic. Appreciate your attendance and seriously appreciate your attention and look forward to interacting with you in the next economics video.